folks. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. It's Thursday, November 2nd, 2017, and I'm very happy to be with you today and glad you're with me. Today, I want to respond to another listener. I love getting stuff from you folks. Again, Jeff at dailyevolver.com, or you can send me a voice memo through that. And you can also register for these Zoom webcasts, and you can make comments in real time and so forth. But I love hearing from you. So this is from a listener who's also a friend. I know him. And, you know, he and I have a kind of a friendly argument around climate. You know, we both sort of agree with what needs to be done, but we have very different stories about how it all works. And I think he may have called me a denier at the time or two, and I may have called him an alarmist. I do not recall. But at any rate, it's all been friendly. But he sends me an article from a writer called Dmitry Orlov. And he writes, if you honestly see how technology or the evolution of consciousness, it can overcome or sidestep one or more of the four trends that Orlov suggests here, that they are pretty much inevitable, please let me know how. So I think, okay, because you know, I might learn something here. So I look at this article by Dmitry Orlov called The Shape of the Future. And he starts out by saying, I believe that the general shape of the future can be guessed at by focusing on the following four factors. 1, weather. 2, energy. 3, population. And 4, geopolitics. Let's look at each one. So he starts with weather, and I'm certainly not going to read the whole thing. It's not all that long, actually, but I'm going to read the first paragraph of the first section on weather. So he starts. The short-term shifts in weather, driven by longer-term climate change resulting from dramatically increased atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane levels, are already having several important impacts that are plain to see. Tropical cyclones are more intense and wetter, resulting in massive floods and infrastructure damage. Just this year's storms have knocked out much of Houston, quite a bit of Florida, and virtually all of Puerto Rico, and a few other islands in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, unprecedented fires have ravaged parts of California and the Pacific Northwest. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced or rendered homeless. Such trends are likely to continue as these destructive events grow in intensity. And, you know, so I'm reading so far so good in terms of a, you know, summation of what's been happening this year alone. Then he goes on. For a time, people will attempt to recover and rebuild after each event. But after a while, these efforts will cease. In rebuilding, I am quite certain that most people will refuse to take reasonable steps to avoid repeats. People will refuse to take reasonable steps to avoid repeats, such as building houses on pilings or out of non-flammable materials. Instead, they will put up the same flammable, flood-prone structures because that's what they think a house should look like. And at this point, I think I'm slightly offended on behalf of humanity. And I think, do I have to read the rest of this? And, you know, this is where environmentalism jumps the shark, you know, with these, you know, not necessarily with the analysis of what's happening. That's, you know, hard science can always correct us there, even though we tend to blow off course depending on our ideology. But in terms of the scenarios, and the idea that people will get tired and these efforts at rebuilding will cease and they'll just keep putting up the same structures because that's what they think a house should look like, is just crazy, actually. And it's funny, I had a journalism professor in college who said that most people tend to believe what they read until the what they're reading covers something that they actually experienced. And then they realize, it's a little slipperier than that. And, in this case, I have firsthand experience from living in Florida for 8 years. And in Florida, it's just the exact opposite. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which was a huge Category 5 hurricane that I think caused the greatest amount of damage still. But at any rate, it was huge, hit Miami. And after that, there was a whole new set of building codes that came online for the state for coastal properties. And everything had to be built at least 18 feet above median high tide. And if you were close to the beach, that means you had to put your house up on stilts, which is what ours was. Ours was built 18 feet up with these breakaway walls. And underneath the house, you could have 18 feet of water flow through and really not bother the living quarters. Now, those standards have continued to increase over the years. It's now for new construction, 22 feet above median high tide. We had to have hurricane glass, and they have glass now that will withstand winds of 200 miles an hour. And I remember them demonstrating it by hitting a 2x4 into the glass at 100 miles an hour. And, it survived. You have to have that. And I'm not there anymore, but I have friends. It's actually Bonita Springs, which is right where the Hurricane Irma went through. I saw in the news that I remember the headline, Naples devastated. That's the town next to where we were. And, I looked and saw these pictures of the homes underwater. And it turns out that happened, of course. And it happened along the rivers. It happened, and it was actually a trailer court that they showed. But by and large, the town had trees blow over. They actually come and set them back up again and stake them in, and they live. These trees have very shallow roots. And, they're basically fine now. And now that's Florida. And Florida, because of Andrew, is really ahead of the curve. I think further ahead than Houston was, and certainly Puerto Rico. And so we see the devastation in Puerto Rico. And, aside from all of whatever bungling and mendacity of the Trump administration, which I'm not going to get into because I haven't sorted it out, but we could just see that from a developmental perspective, Puerto Rico had more traditional structures. They didn't have modern structures. And that's just basically if you look at the story of these storms in Florida, we lived on a beach where there were houses that were built right on the sand, and they had been there for 50 and 60 years. And finally, some hurricane comes through and they're gone. And then they build them up on stilts. And that process is just sort of a natural process because people do rebuild better. That's why we don't still live in caves. So in Puerto Rico, they had a far less developed structure that it was very, when this Category 5 hits it right in the bullseye, that's a great big devastation. But my view is, and I think history will bear this out, is that Puerto Rico 10 years from now or 5 years from now will be a far better built, country or state or territory, island. And this is basically the upside of, if you could call it that, of Naomi Klein's, what I think is somewhat misguided shock doctrine. The idea that when traditional communities are wiped out by natural disasters, modernity, the next stage of development, comes in and rebuilds. And yes, it is run on money. And yes, it is blind to culture and things that are not money. And that's something that we appreciate having pointed out and, brought into the system. And that's the sort of a postmodern view that's, sort of a little bit reflexively anti-modern because it's pushing off of modernity and it sees all of the sins of modernity, which are, largely environmental. And on balance, I'll take the deal because, it's like, where is it? the Time magazine that came after the two storms, Jose and Irma, the headline, "The storms keep getting stronger, and so do we." And the opening paragraph of the article is, "The Sunshine State didn't break. Its cities didn't tumble. Yes, roughly 12 million Floridians lost power. Yes, up to 7 million were evacuated or dislocated. Yes, up to 600 shelters had to open across the state. But the shelters did open fast. The people in harm's way did evacuate. And the first responders were there when they needed to be there." So that's, modernity and how we will and are responding to climate change at the same time that we're minimizing the causes of climate change. And we can argue about the speed and so forth, but I just want to point out that this is happening. I mean, in Miami, my friend who lives down there was talking about, he's a civil engineer, and he's just astonished at what they're doing with raising streets and putting pumping systems in and preparing for, with new developments, higher sea levels. We're actually not frogs in a barrel, people. We do notice, and we do respond, and we are responding. But that's nowhere in this article from Orlov. And I just want to look at his other four categories. So that was weather. He talks about geopolitics. He says, he has 3 or 4 paragraphs. It's not, again, all that long. He says, "Political unrest is always a wild card because it is difficult to predict when a certain previously docile population will suddenly erupt in violence." And it's actually not that hard. I mean, docile modern populations, first of all, don't suddenly erupt in violence. You might have pockets of it that are probably pre-modern in consciousness, but where you do see previously docile populations suddenly erupt is where you had some authoritarian lid on traditional and even pre-traditional people. So you have this mafia lid on these, sort of tribal, clannish, religious warrior people. And when that gets taken off by bombing Iraq, for instance, you get previously docile people arise. So, we could actually sort that out. He talks about in energy. Renewable sources, such as wind generators and solar panels, cannot be produced or maintained without a fossil fuels-based industry. Okay, I guess that's true for now. And produce a product, electricity, for which there won't be much demand once fossil fuels-based industry goes away. I don't know what to say about that. Population. Aside from, and perhaps coupled with factors such as weather and energy, certain populations will fail to thrive and will go through a die-off. The US is going through a die-off right now, with alcoholism rates doubling in a decade and an epidemic of opioid abuse that rivals China's experience prior to the 1950s. The spirit of utter hopelessness now gripping the US is similar to what happened in the former USSR after the Soviet collapse, with similar demographic consequences. The spirit of utter hopelessness now gripping the US? I mean, I think that says a lot more about his spirit than it does the spirit of the US. And, this is the problem. I've heard of this Dmitry Orlov. I actually went to his website. He has a bunch of books. He's, has a following. He, is a voice in this environmental movement. And it's like, gosh, you could see why modern and traditional people just reject environmentalism, as it is often articulated by this progressive edge that is religiously environmental. And let me just sort of put a little bit of context in that statement. Environmentalism, we can look at, there's really 2 phases that you can look at: modern environmentalism and postmodern environmentalism. And modern environmentalism came on in my lifetime, and I'm in my 60s. And when I was a kid, people would throw their trash out of the windows as they drove by lived on a country road. We were just about far enough away from Tasty Freeze that they were done with their French fries and they threw out their bag in front of our house. And that's just, we didn't think much of it. We would go out and pick them up occasionally. Jeff, go pick up the bags, my mother would say. And we did. And then Lady Bird Johnson came on with this, please, please don't be a litter bug, you know, this whole thing. I still remember that song. And all of a sudden it stopped. And, you know, consciousness was raised. It's just, we went from a traditional idea where, you know, my dad and I, we would take our garbage and our, you know, cans and stuff we couldn't burn. Of course, we burned everything. We burned garbage every day in our backyard, smoke and soot and whatever. And we would take the stuff we couldn't burn back to the dump. And everybody had a dump. And it was back in the woods, and it was over a ravine, and we didn't see it anymore. And then one day, the guy who owned the property on the other side came to my dad and said, "Would you mind stopping that? Because, you know, we're going to build a house, and we don't want to look at it." And my dad said, "Oh, yeah," he was a little sheepish about it. And then the garbage truck started coming, and, you know, this is environmentalism phase one. This is where the rivers and lakes of Western Pennsylvania, where I grew up, the brown cloud in Denver, the worst of the smog in LA was cleaned up. People didn't want their kids breathing in that kind of stuff and not being able to go play in the river. So that's environmental phase one. You clean up your neck of the woods, and that happened. And most people are on board for that. Modernists, traditionalists even, could get on board for that. Phase two environmentalism comes online when we develop a world-centric consciousness. And this is, of course, one of the markers of green, postmodern, you know, cutting-edge culture, where we start, and it's again, one of these sort of spontaneous arisings of our psyche, where all of a sudden we feel the whole world. You know, we feel the whole world system. We start getting interested in other cultures instead of, you know, spooked by them. And, you know, we want to breathe it all in. And we see that we actually, this is our backyard, that there is a limited planet. And there are ways in which we've hit the limits in terms of carbon and methane in the environment and so forth. And you know, the alarms raise, and the oceans are acidifying, and you know, there's finite systems that we see at world-centric that you don't see before that. And that's a big problem too with environmentalism, even non-alarmist environmentalism, is that we're dealing with 2/3 of the population who don't see world-centrically and feel like you're like trying to get something over and you're running an agenda on them. And you think that they're stupid. And you do. Listen to Bill Maher, you know. And the problem is that when you know, let the anti-modernist impulse of postmodernity, of course, every stage jumps off of the previous one because they're sick of it. And they see the, you know, pernicious downsides of it. You know, and of course, modernity's mindless growth model, you know, and just eating up the environment. Postmodernity says, stop that, you know, and this is a beautiful thing, but it's still first tier in the sense that every stage believes their worldview religiously, that it is revealed. And so the, you know, religion, the sort of deep structure that we have, that is this idea that we have sinned against nature and we have to be punished. And there is a great flood, an apocalypse coming. This is deep stuff. Every culture has versions of it. And so does green, so does postmodernity. And that's where it's not only doesn't make sense to the modern and pre-modern stage of development, but it's offensive, it's frightening. You know, you people want to completely put a lid on the industrial society that gives us all the goodies. So this is, you know, an integral way of sorting out what's going on. And there is stuff going on. I mean, I was really sobered by a column by Thomas Friedman, who I generally think is right on. He's one of the columnists in the New York Times, a reliable liberal, but a smart, I think, integral thinker for the most part. And this is one of his articles called Trump, Niger, and Making the Dots Connect. And he's talking about what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa climate-wise. And he writes, climate change in the region is so severe that nearby Senegal's National Weather Bureau says that from 1950 to 2015, the average temperature rose 2 degrees Celsius, and the average annual rainfall declined by about 2 inches. In other words, parts of sub-Saharan Africa are already at the heat levels that Paris was supposed to prevent by the end of the century. And the region is heading for a 4-degree rise, which will lead to the collapse of even more small farms and lead to a mad scramble of refugees towards Europe, competition for food, and more unemployed males ready to join ISIS for $50 a week. He talked about looking at these 3 maps of Africa with the dots concentrated in the middle of the continent. Map number 1, the most vulnerable regions of desertification in 2008. Map number 2, conflicts and food riots in 2007 and 2008. And map number 3, terrorist attacks in 2012. All the dots of all 3 maps cluster around Niger and its neighbors. Hello? So, this is where these people are the most vulnerable, and they're the least developed technologically and in terms of the ways they think, that are post-tribal and post-clan and moving into modernity themselves. But it can happen pretty quickly. When it happens, we look at Mexico, Sri Lanka, 2 countries where the birth rate went from 7 to 1.9 in basically a generation. And, once people, consciousness gets downloaded, it can happen quickly. But these are the people most vulnerable to climate change. So, so I go back to Orloff and his, what I consider to be a sort of a fever dream, of wrong facts, but still maybe, there's an argument, and I'm open to it. And this is the argument that my friend uses, who sent me this, that, there may be prophets of a new truth, that people might be getting a download of coming doom. I mean, of course, that's always been true, so I tend to, whatever. But, I don't want to be the boy who cried wolf. And so they're actually getting something, but it's, you can't really present it as fact. You can present it as prophecy, fair enough. And prophecy is real. There are people who actually, they've got an impulse of something coming. So I want to stay open to that as an integralist. But, integral actually helps us sort these things out. I was talking to another friend of mine who is very bright. I've learned a lot from her. And she was telling me that she was talking to a shaman who told her that the world had actually gone off of its axis. And that's, was what was true and happening. And, here's where we could sort things out a little bit. Is the world going off its axis actually in terms of the poles and the movement and the time? And it was also something about things slowing down. And no, we have the National Bureau of Standards about 5 miles from here. And they have the atomic clocks, and they have, if anything like that is happening, this is what science can do. Science can tell us that the world is actually not going off its axis, or time is not actually slowing down or speeding up or whatever it was that this shaman had this vision of. Now, that is the purpose of science, is that it wrings these superstitions out of the system so that we don't conflate interior revelation with exterior revelation, okay? So what this doesn't mean, so what science can't do is deny or discount. It'll try to do both, but from an integral perspective, we actually want to take the shaman seriously. How is the world off its axis? You know, that's a whole other question. And it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, making claims that can be easily refuted by science and modernity. So we want both, but we don't want them conflated, because then we get all worked up and it doesn't help. All right. So thanks, everybody. Gosh, the end of another week. And it's so much fun doing these daily shows. And thank you for joining me. And would ask you, Corey, what are you thinking today?
Oh, Jesus, man. So many needles to thread here. I think the one of the main sort of challenges that the left is facing right now is how to convey an appropriate amount of urgency without it becoming alarmism. Because you're right, alarmism just turns people off immediately. And usually that alarmism is coming from, you know, sort of a very limbic place. It's coming from a very emotional, even a very mythological place. As you say, you know, a lot of the sort of deep structures of the environmental movement, at least in this country, are, I mean, it looks like a religion, and that's what the conservatives say. You know, they say you're basically replacing the church with the state, and you're worshiping at the, you know, altar of this
Gaia.
At the altar of Gaia, or the altar of this sort of globalist, you know, elite Illuminati plan to use climate change to dominate everything. But the thing of it is, you know, urgency is, again, completely appropriate. I mean, we've got a guy who is the head of the EPA right now, who, you know, what's this quote? This is what Scott Pruitt said: true environmentalism is using natural resources that God has blessed us with.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the head of the EPA, and he's basically saying, no, environmentalism is exploitation.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, God gave us, Corey, God gave us dominion over the earth.
That's right.
All the, you know, all the beings therein.
And we have always been at war with Eurasia. I mean, it's, you know, it's getting pretty twisted. And that's where I think a lot of the alarmism actually comes from, is the obstruction, the religious, the deeply held religious obstruction that's preventing any of these sensible environmental solutions from actually finding any traction.
Yeah.
You know,
and actually, you know, from an integral perspective, we want to say, what's the beautiful piece of this? You know, it expresses itself in alarmism, but the impulse is, what a beautiful, precious place we live in.
Yeah.
And we envision a society where everybody has their place, and it's safe, and children can play, and the air is clean, and the water's clean, and there's not too many of us, and nobody's getting dominated. And oh my God, I mean, could we just pause and appreciate the green insight, the green impulse to create this better, beautiful world? So yes, we want that. That, I think, is true of the sacred world to come.
Yep.
But the other thing that integral brings to the party is that we don't have to we could do it from urgency, but not from panic or fear.
That's right.
Because first of all, those don't help. And secondly, urgency and creativity and taking it seriously and responding. Again, the arguments I have with my friend, we actually don't do that much differently. I mean, I watch my lights, and I conserve water. And, you know, I was a environmental fanatic for years. I refused to use sprinklers, and, you know, I would wash out my plastic and never, you know, all that kind of stuff. And of course, voting, I want carbon tax. I generally let Thomas Friedman lead me in terms of policy around environmentalism, because he's clearly a active environmentalist, but he seems to have an integral perspective. And my friend's not that far off, but it's just the story we tell.
Right.
It's a different, and I think that matters.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jeff, I really appreciate.
It's a story we're telling to the rest of the culture too. So we got to get it right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I really love how you sort of differentiated sort of more local environmentalism from more global, and obviously both are required. And the local is really good at enacting actual policy solutions that will clean that lake or will reduce that smog. And but what it's not capable of doing, and that's the real pressure from which the global response is coming, is America can play this game and clean up its backyard as much as it wants to, but if India and China and so forth don't also do the same, then we're just wasting money, and we might as well be profiting on our sort of road to hell. And that's completely appropriate. But as soon as, I think what it does, Jeff, is it actually foregrounds one of the largest problems that liberalism is facing today, which is that most of these green ideas are not being carried in a green way. They're actually being carried in a very amber fundamentalist way. And today's liberals, in a lot of ways, I just saw this comparison recently, today's liberals in a lot of ways are similar to the evangelicals in the 90s. In terms of telling you what you can say, what you can't say, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and sort of really having this sort of neo-puritanical sort of impulse to try to control the discourse, and that's exactly what we can't do, right? That's precisely wrong.
It's what we do.
It is what we do, and it's end up in stepping in doo-doo.
It creates a lot of doo-doo.
Yeah. Well, and just sort of personal story, I grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is in Berkshire County. It was once a beautiful city, small city, but, just absolutely gorgeous. Has a lot of that, sort of 16th, 17th century architecture, and, it's really pretty. And the leaves are gorgeous. The foliage is gorgeous. It's known for being, it's for its environment being absolutely gorgeous. So I lived in Pittsfield, and when I was growing up, GE, General Electric, had one of their largest plants in the country in Pittsfield. We were actually, during the Cold War, I think we were like number 8 on the list to get nuked or something, because they made some tracking device for our missiles. And
wow.
So, it was a sort of a big deal factory in Pittsfield. And GE kind of fucked that town in a couple ways, and sort of fucked my family. So as it turns out, in the 1980s, it was discovered that GE had been dumping chemicals into the water, into the river for decades. And, those PCBs basically infected all the water lines. And particularly, there's a lake in the middle of Pittsfield that's very appropriately called Silver Lake. To this day, I just, I haven't been back there in a couple of decades, but I just imagined this large pool of mercury, basically. And, all those PCBs got into the rivers and the creeks. And my grandparents had a dairy farm in the town right next to Pittsfield called Lenox, Mass. And the creek ran right through the property. The PCBs ended up infecting the land. A couple years later,
beautiful bucolic creek, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I used to, I have some of my best childhood memories are damming that creek with my cousin, and little did I know I was waist deep in carcinogens. Grandpa ends up dying of cancer just a few years later, completely caused by this. And, what ended up happening was GE ended up buying all of that property from my grandparents, except for the little yellow house at the end of the driveway where my great-grandparents used to live. And now that's where my grandmother lives, while watching her farmhouse and the barn and all that get destroyed by GE because they own the property now. And it's an incredibly sad, tragic story. And, probably gave me a lot of, my sort of I was able to hit green fairly early, probably because of those experiences.
Yep. Right on.
Right? So I'm.
Me too, actually.
Yeah.
I won't tell it, but I have a very similar story about how the mines came in and screwed up our creek, and and people just sort of accepted it, and until they didn't.
Right.
And this is, the movement forward. And this is part of what came online with the environmental movement of the 60s, which was green, but
Right.
it wasn't mean green like some of the stuff I was just pointing out. It was reasonable green.
That's right.
That actually had traction, and a lot of that was cleaned up. And that's what green does. That's green's job, is to rein in the mindlessness of modernity.
Yep, that's right.
Technological modernity.
That's right. That's right. Well, and doing environmentalism on a local level is always going to be easier. It's always going to be easier to muster the political will required to actually enact those solutions, because you can feel them. And if you can't feel them, you know someone who did. I know someone who died of cancer because of what GE did, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when we're talking about sort of these, carbon taxes and, all of this stuff, it's so abstract. And this is where, again, leftism has really failed. And we've had people like Al Gore trying to, give us the hockey stick and all that stuff, and trying to actually generate more of an emotional response. And we kind of swung and missed there. We went a little too far into those emotional responses.
Yeah, no, it's true. You make people care about a bigger circle of awareness than they have.
That's right.
For a lot of people, even me, reading Thomas Friedman about what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, I was like shocked and sort of ashamed that I didn't know more about that. You know what I mean? And, but if I talk to a lot of friends or people, they're going to hear it and they're going to forget about it the next minute.
That's right.
We live here in Colorado. It's a little warmer. Kind of okay with me. The winters are long and cold here, you know.
But as soon, exactly.
I have to worry about the sea levels in Miami. But yes, but you don't until you do.
That's right.
And that's where we can actually trust emergence as integralists more than, having this idea that as green, we have to get in there and grab people by the lapel and change their fucking minds.
That's right.
And set them straight.
Yep. The only way out is through. It's definitely not back. And through means innovation. And, and as you say, Jeff, it really, it's one thing to live in Boulder, and, I've been here for 17 years, and, I can be like, our winters are so different than they were when I moved here, and they are, but, that's not much of an impact. But the minute you take the perspective of that Syrian refugee whose family was killed by these, terrible uprisings, and all of which was fueled by the migration that's coming from the famine, that's coming from the climate change, that's when it really starts to land for us. And those are the stories I think that green should be doing a better job of telling, rather than just trying to either freak you out by telling you how horrible, this opposing political party is, or by giving you some apocalyptic sky is falling kind of vision. No, we're going to innovate our way out of this. We always do. We always have. So actually David Satterley has a sort of a good news, bad news comment that he left here. I'll read it out loud. So we were talking about earlier when you were talking about Florida. U.S. flood insurance usually makes it no pain to rebuild. Other areas have flooding, drought, famine that's causing political unrest and refugees. In another century, Canada and Siberia might be growing our wheat. New energy generation technology and material science gives hope for astonishing, secure alternatives. Really, I expect several billions to die in the crisis. But I learned in business that if you really want to force accelerated change, you have to let people suffer the effects of the problem. Thanks for the inspiration and for making me want to slit my wrists, David.
Yeah, I don't know about the billions, but whatever.
I
certainly don't rule it out.
I absolutely, I think it is absolutely possible. And I certainly think it's probable that we're not going to begin to address the problems fully until we actually start seeing people dying, and still that's another unfortunate part of human nature, is that we are really good at adapting once the environment changes. We're not so good at preemptively.
Well, and I think, also that, a lot of this just happens from the ground up too, from the bottom up, if you will, with just people getting conscious, people buying electrical cars, people, what's happening in China. I mean, China's actually going through that phase 1 environmentalism. They just want to clean up their, so their kids don't have to wear masks to school.
Yep.
And, but as an enlightened authoritarian government, they can do things a lot more efficiently.
Yep.
So anyway.
Yep.
More to come. Lots of this is a big topic we can sort out over.
Yeah, it is. It is. And we have another question from
okay.
from a listener, Ryan. Actually, let me just check something real quick. And Michelle has her hand raised. We've got a busy audience today. This is great. So Ryan asks, what are some, I don't know if we have an answer to this, what are some concrete examples of what Integral can bring to lower right fields such as urban design, architecture, city planning, and even agriculture? I've heard the term integral architecture mentioned several times, but haven't seen anything specific in these areas. As a farmer and landscaper, I'd love to see more focus from the Integral community in the lower right quadrant. Thanks so much to the both of you for another great show. Well, thank you, Ryan. And geez, I wish I had a way to answer your question.
Me too. I always love when people say, the integral community needs to do X, Y, Z, because it's true. We're just so new that everything needs to be done. And I don't know much. I have heard about integral architecture too, but and I'm sure, we want an architecture that has it's human scales and it's sustainable. And, there's some things that are kind of obvious that we would see from integral architecture. But what I would say is to Ryan is, come on, man, you tell us what integral architecture is. Send me some stuff and I was going to assign you a project. You go out there and find it and let us know.
Yeah. Well, one example I can think of, which our colleague, David Reardon talks about a lot, and I can't remember the city. But there's some city. It's not Amsterdam, but it's I think one of those cities that has been really threatened by climate change and by rising tides and all that. And for decades, the response has been to build increasingly higher walls to keep those floodwaters at bay. And apparently, recently, they've completely changed their approach, which is sort of an acceptance of the inevitable in a certain sense. So this is rather than operating from a mode of environmentalism that's largely still in a bit of denial and still has some of that kind of anti-modern, if we just get rid of all the factories, the sea levels will go down and, totally untenable. So I think, from what I understand, what the city did is actually change the policy. And they said, instead of building those walls higher, because who wants to live behind these massively high walls anyway? Instead of building them higher, we're actually going to tear down the walls and we're going to let the water in. And, we're going to drop some hydroelectric, dams all along these sort of causeways that we're creating for the water that'll be rushing in. And we're going to produce, energy out of it. And to me, that was a much more interesting solution. Because it's one that actually says, okay, things are changing. We're only going to be able to do so much globally to change, to affect the rate of change that we're seeing. So what are the strategies of resilience and the strategies of adaptability that we can actually bring to this? And I think that's huge. I think actually bringing those values, making them explicit, bringing them really into the foreground of don't just.
What's like in Bonita Springs where, I was talking about where we lived. Some of the houses on the river got flooded in this last thing, Irma. And so the city's buying up the property and turning it into parkland, that can handle a flood.
Yep.
And that's part of the response.
Yep.
It's what you're talking about. It's just a small scale, but that's happening all over the place. The trailer court that was flooded, they're either going to have to build it up or move.
Right.
And, that's tragic, but it's not the frog in the barrel.
That's right.
That's
right. No, I agree. We're not frogs in a barrel. We're more like crabs in a barrel.
Yeah, thank you.
We pull each other down as we're trying to climb up.
We get crabby.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. So we have another question from Michelle. So I'm going to bring her on. She should be rejoining as a panelist. Let's unmute her audio. Hello, Michelle. We see your forehead.
Hello, Michelle's forehead. Oh, there's Michelle.
Yeah. Well, hi. I love you guys. I listen to you as much as I can. So thank you. And I really just wanted to share because today my partner and I launched a program in a high school where we're really using a lot of integral principles and working with teens on internships with social entrepreneurial companies. And we are just getting amazing response, even though a lot of times people aren't, it's a lot of fun to sort of just work through how to language it, how to communicate it, what people are understanding, how to pull it into, their frame of reference. But yeah, so far.
What's the basic thrust, or what's the headlighted first paragraph of what you're doing?
So we're setting up basic. So we have like real businesses that are like social good companies, and they give us a real business challenge. And then we take the kids through an 8-week internship where they're going to work through the actual.
What's a typical challenge?
Well, with this company, it's a biodegradable toothbrush. So they've been in business for about 5 years, and they want to sell more toothbrushes. So we're going to have the kids sort of just work on that problem, but we're going to work at it from a perspective of, how do we look at perspectives? How do we hold mindfulness? How do we look at problems differently? So today, we walked through what are traditional perspectives, what would be the modern perspective.
Oh my goodness. Hallelujah.
Of looking at, and they could immediately identify where they were and where the company was. We looked through just, what is the business's perspective from what are they prioritizing? Next week, I'm then going to take them through kind of a 3-2-1 as to like what is your communication perspective? Are you going to, talk about this from your first person, your second person, your third person, and just keep kind of look through like maturity of competition, immaturity in competition. And like you said, I mean, it's a rural county in Georgia that picked us up.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had to share with somebody who kind of knew what I was doing because
that's just wonderful, Michelle. And stay in touch and keep us posted. It'd be fun to have a full report.
Maybe
we could do an episode on it. I'm. Of course, any kind of a real world execution of integral principles is interesting because it's, we've been thinking about it and talking about it. There's still more thinking and talking to do, but to get actually out there and try it and get feedback and see what's happening, is so juicy and rich. And then also, I just think about these kids, I mean, some of what you're teaching them, I learned when I was 50. So I just can't wait to see what becomes of them. So thank you, Michelle.
Me too. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Well, that was great.
Yeah.
I love, again, as you said, Jeff, I just love getting those sort of reports of how and where the integral rubber is hitting the road.
Right on. Yeah, that's right. And
cool.
It is all over the place.
It really is.
And when you consider that it didn't exist, the integral community didn't exist 15 years ago.
That's right.
It's astonishing. It's a blink of an eye.
Yep.
And so God bless us all, everyone.
Amen.
All right, man. You have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
You too, brother.
All right, brother. Bye.
Bye.